Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. This is Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I just realized, I was looking at my calendar here, when this episode that we're recording comes out next week, I will be at my first ever podcast movement conference.
I know, that's so cool.
You know what's funny is I am oddly, nervous is not quite the right word, because that's a little, I'm not actually nervous per se. But it's something different than just excited. It almost feels like I'm I don't know, like my first day at high school or something.
It's, I went once. I went to Podcast Movement in 2016 in Chicago. And the cool thing is, obviously true to its name, everybody there is associated with podcasting in some way. They're in front of the mics, they're behind the mics, they're doing production, they're doing advertising, but they're all focused on podcasting, and they do view it as a movement. It's not called Podcast Con. It's not called a trade show. They view it as a movement. And I found myself a lot of times in this hall with, hundreds of people, and you're standing next to people you don't know. And all you need to do is say, so what's your podcast about? Right. It's like the most boring pickup line in the world.
Right.
But you see people's eyes light up. They're like, oh, I talk to left-handed waiters in the French restaurant industry.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think and we could probably do a whole podcast episode on this after I get back, on something on like prioritizing and how do you decide, how to not drink from a fire hose at something like this. But I've been to a lot of conferences in my life. I think this might be the first one I've ever gone to that, like, as this kind of attendee, where like I'm there for something that I am interested and passionate about, and versus I'm there for a business reason.
Right.
Like I did trade shows when I was with the architecture firm, things like that. So it's just I'm really excited. So I hopefully will have some cool new things that I can share with you guys when I get back.
Yeah, there is a real difference, by the way, in going to this, because I've gone to a lot of bar association conferences. Mm-hmm. And so I'll go and I'll attend different seminars and workshops, and I'll present seminars and workshops on how to address this practice area, that practice area, get better here and get better there for your clients, mm-hmm. which is great. But Podcast Movement you're right. It's one of the first things where you're like, no, I want to get better for me. This is what I really want to do.
Yeah, to go up there, just absorb everything. So anyway, as you can tell, I'm a little excited. So why don't you thank our sponsors, and then we'll get rolling.
Right. As always, I want to thank Tom Loveland at Mind Over Machines, Katz Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Marycraft Staffing and HR Solutions.
Speaking of Marycraft Staffing, I did forget to say one thing.
HR Solutions.
And Marycraft Staffing and HR Solutions, correct. So the Facebook group, we always like to mention our new members of the week, and Lisa Benson just joined the Facebook group, and she's actually the CEO of Marycraft.
Nice.
Yeah. So it'll be really lovely to have her there. She is, I know her personally, and she is such a wise is the word that just comes to mind over and over again, wise and insightful and thoughtful human being. I'm really excited to have her there in the conversation. So
very cool.
Yay.
All
right.
So do you have a story?
I do.
Let's go.
So here's my story, and I'll tell this story carefully. I can tell it generally because it's a very personal story for someone, and it's not my story. So that's a line I always hold in the world of confidentiality. When something's not my story, I don't tell it. So I am going to tell pieces of this, but might keep it a little bit vague. So a very good friend of mine and I were talking in the past week or two. She and her husband are having some marriage issues, and as all married people do at one time or another. And we got to this point in the conversation, and it occurs to me now after I went through that whole preamble, details are irrelevant here because I think everyone can find some sort of space in this where they've had these kinds of thoughts. Where at one point we were talking about contemplation, about the difference between about whether or not she stays or goes, which I think is sort of the obvious question that people can empathize with. But then we got to this really interesting point in the conversation where I was asking her, because I sensed this like weird energy when she talked about staying, and she wasn't super excited about going, but there was something really convoluted about the way she talked about staying. And so I asked her a question that ended up becoming this wildly fascinating conversation that I've now been thinking about in so many other contexts, including business, which is, what is the difference between staying and not leaving?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I just want to pause for a second there to sort of let that sink in. So there's going. So staying and going, those are clearly opposite.
Seems like an affirmative choice. You're going.
Going is a choice. Staying felt weird, and there's like a snag in the way she talked about staying. And I was like, what's the difference between staying and not leaving? And her whole body posture just sort of like slumped. And she goes, yeah, it's actually hard for me to imagine staying. It only feels like not leaving.
But there's such a different energy about those two.
Yes. So, and we could go into that aspect of it from relationships, but I want to, I want to relate it quickly over to something that I see happen so often in the teams and the partnerships that I work with, where, because I don't actually, in that context, there is something that looks like not leaving. But the way that I sort of see this happen, and the conversation I wanted to open up here, is I think sometimes that middle lane sort of is imagined like it's a place that you can hang out.
The not leaving lane.
The not leaving lane. And it's, we could argue that in marriages, maybe that does exist. But I think, I don't know that I believe it exists, or it shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist anywhere, really, I don't think. But in companies, what I see happen sometimes is there'll be an employee that someone's frustrated with, and or it can even happen as you are the employee. But in this case, like, there's an employee you're frustrated with, and you're not ready to terminate them.
Right.
Like, they're super clear on that. Like, no. We don't want to get rid of them. Like, they provide value, or we think they have potential, or whatever it is, or it's just would be a hassle to lose that person right now. So they're not ready to terminate them. But they're also not really in the energetic space of committing to that person. They imagine that there's sort of this middle ground of, And I really strongly believe that is a dangerous perception, that there is this sort of middle lane where you can hang out between the two. But I'm curious if that is just my perspective, or I want to hear what you think about that.
Well, I guess one of my questions is, do you think that middle lane of not staying is equivalent to saying, I don't want to terminate them, but if given the chance, I wouldn't rehire them again?
I think it could be a lot of things. I absolutely that. Like, I'll just let them kind of hold. So let's break it down, because I think there's a couple different circumstances. The place where I see it be the most dangerous is if I'm there to help if I'm working with somebody who is problematic for some reason, which I don't do a ton of, but, and the person that has asked me to work with them is trying to sort of stay in this middle lane. This is where it's really dangerous, because if you're not ready to fire them, I need you in I'm committed to this. Because if that middle lane sticks an oar in the water, and we're already trying to turn the tide on something really complicated, usually we're asking somebody to counteract lifelong coping mechanisms that they've had, and that's a big ask. So that's already hard without somebody kind of talking the talk of being supportive, but they really don't believe it's possible.
Well, I get this question a lot, and I get a little bit farther along in the thought process. So I'll have a client that calls me and says, I need to talk to you about an HR issue, specifically about an employee. So right away, the background is they've taken the step of calling their attorney. This isn't musing to their spouse or just thinking on the way home. They've called their attorney.
Yeah.
And so the conversation often goes, this happened. I'm talking about, Lisa and all of these
Not
things.
Lisa Benson.
Not Lisa Benson.
To be clear.
Because if we were talking about Lisa, we'd probably need Mary Craft Staffing and HR Solutions to fill that void. But anyway, so I'm talking about
other Lisa.
And all of these things have combined to make this person a problem for me. And I'll say, well, do you want to fire them? Because I'm going to, do they have an employment contract? Are they at will, et cetera? No, I don't really want to fire them. I'm just wondering how to get my ducks in a row to do that. And then maybe I should just have a talk that says, here are my concerns. and I need you to address these within the next X number of days. And so this is the next question, which is, what if they do address it in the next number of days? What if you've said, here are 3 things that I need you to address, and they do that in 30 days? Are you going to be happy keeping them? Because you can't, the rules of the game are, you can't say, address these 3 things, they address these 3 things, and you look at them and go, yeah, I'm still going to fire you. Yeah.
Well, this does actually tie directly back to my original origin story of this podcast, which is that was exactly the conversation we were having. It was coming around this. So I think this is one version of why it's problematic. If my friend is saying, well, husband, I'm disgruntled about X, Y, and Z, and husband magically changes X, Y, and Z and magically does everything that she asks, is she going to be happy, or is that just sort of is she saying it because she's hoping he won't do X, Y, and Z, and then she'll which is a really confronting question. I think it's where, so this thing you're talking about, I think is where stuck ends, or that feeling of being stuck or not having choices. Sometimes it feels like that, but it's actually this. One of the very first coaches I ever met one time said to me, when I said, I feel so stuck, and she goes, well, you know what I think stuck is? What I think stuck is? And I said, what? She said, I think a lot of times stuck is when you already know what you want to do, you're just not ready to do that thing. Or you're not ready to admit that that's what you want to do. And in this case, I think there is sometimes when people are trying to get into that middle lane, they want to look like they're working on it, but they really know what they want.
No, they've made, and that's what I wrote down. You've made the decision emotionally. You've made that emotional decision. You know what your gut reaction is.
You're trying to line up the facts.
You're
around
looking for validation. That's right. You know what car you want to buy.
Right.
Now you're asking about the mileage because you're hoping it gets good mileage so you can back up your initial decision to buy it. If you've already made the decision, in my world, if you've already made the decision that you're going to fire this person, then unless you really believe, unless we kind of brainstorm and say, you know what, if you fire this person, you're going to be sued faster than you can turn around. Mm-hmm. And so you better take certain steps in corporate self-defense. Unless it's that. If you don't have that, we try to get to the bottom of, well, have you already made the decision to fire this person? Because
don't make them work on it.
Don't make them work on it. And don't set up a process where their best outcome leaves you disappointed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There's that quote, and this doesn't exactly apply, but it always makes me think of it when I see it, that that's like I don't know, it's a whole meme thing. It says like, what if we invest in people and they leave? And it says, well, what if you don't invest in them and they stay? It's a tiny bit like that. Like your heart's not in trying to get them to change, or get them to do what you need. So there's so many aspects to this that I hope it's not getting confusing, because it feels applicable in a lot of ways. But sort of in this same mix, Blessing White is this really fantastic company that has all this research and modeling, like models around engagement that are some of my favorite, because they address both what the organization's role is in engagement as well as the individual's role in engagement, which is not always addressed. So I think that's super important. But they have this sort of X model of engagement that shows like personal satisfaction and company and organizational contribution as an X. And then in that square in the middle, they have this grid of engagement sort of profiles. And somebody might be high on personal satisfaction, but low on company contribution. But that might be because they're brand new. That's not always bad. It's like people move from one place to the other. Mm-hmm. And then I'll not quote it correctly if I try and say it right now. So maybe I can get it for Christy in the show notes. But there's this place, there are a couple places that they point out where people are super at risk. And one of them is like, if they're at this point, you might lose them, or worse. And I think it's like low personal satisfaction, high company contribution. Mm-hmm. That can be like, it says, or maybe it's when they drop down to low on both. It says you risk losing them, or worse. And I love this phrase, they quit and stay.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of we've been talking about it from a like, if you have someone working for you and you're quitting, the employer point of view, but from the employee standpoint, this middle lane, to me, it feels like, taking your foot off the gas. It feels like a kind of compromise that's not the good kind of compromise. It's like resignation maybe, and not in the I quit my job resignation, but kind of like loss of hope, I guess, probably is what feels so important about not imagining that middle lane is a place where much of anything good happens, because it's like this DMZ between ending it or committing to it, where none of the things that you need to make something better exist. There's no hope, there's no passion, there's no drive, there's no commitment, there's nothing. There's nothing to eat there.
There's no hope or drive or commitment. There is yearning, I think, a lot of times. So there are two things that occurred to me. One is that I was always taught that there's always a scale. Every employee has a scale, and they're going to even out the scale between, on one side, what they devote to a company, and on the other side, what they perceive they're getting out. So whether that's money, they think they're underpaid, then they're going to dial back their contributions. Or they think they're undervalued in other things besides money. Or they think that they don't have a future because they're not allowed to get better, and they're going to dial back. So there's that small r resignation part of it. But there is a yearning, and it kind of reminds me, when my dad, as you know, was an attorney. We lived in Baltimore County. He worked around Annapolis, which for people who are not of here is, it's not a horrible commute, but it used to take him about 45 minutes back in the day. And he was in a one-horse town where his practice was. The bottom line was, he wasn't where his client base and his practice and his business life were not where he wanted them to be. He wanted them to be closer to Baltimore County, where he liked the community and where he wanted to be. And what my dad used to tell me, even as I was growing up as a teenager, was, I wish this, I wish that, I wish this would. And even as a teenager, I would say, well, what are you doing? Why don't you just take these steps? And he would come up with all the reasons, many of which were valid. I wasn't
This reminds me of the episode we did about this a while ago with your dad.
Yeah. He would tell me the reasons why he couldn't.
Right.
He couldn't go.
There's an absence of agency.
Yeah. And so there's this wistfulness. So in your job, in that middle lane, I think there's a lot of, on both sides, I wish she was better. I wish she would leave. I wish he would do this. I wish he would do that. Sometimes it's, I wish they would just fire me.
Yes. No, it's this lost zone between two things that I think people start to imagine that. I think here's why it sort of seems like a safe place to hang out. I think people easily get there so take it from the employer perspective. I have somebody that's not working out. Committing to them feels hard and maybe futile and maybe whatever. There's a lot of words you can put there where it feels like, not super exciting to go over there. And firing them sometimes feels exciting, but that feels hard and yucky. And it comes with other things.
It comes with a lot of baggage.
It comes with a lot of baggage. Both things, when both ends of that spectrum come with baggage, I think there's this imagined safe zone in the middle where I'm just going to hang out between the two, and I'm not really going to work on it. But I'm also not going to let them go. And there's this very false sense of security. Like it feels like a safe place, but it is in my perspective, a ranging danger zone. And okay.
No. And because I do have, this is like a 4-story episode. So, also
so here's my other story.
I had mentioned this before too, but I was, engaged before, I met and married.
Just like you had another podcast before you met me.
Yeah, exactly. It's a serial, it's like the dry run before the serious thing. So anyway, there was a time to cut to the chase. There was a time when I realized she was a perfectly wonderful human being, but I didn't want to marry her. And I remember more than one occasion, I was just wishing that I would walk in unexpectedly into the townhouse where she lived and find her in bed with another guy. And then I could go, well, there it is. I guess this is over now, because that's a no-brainer. I'm not the bad guy. Yeah.
Hint, if you find yourself imagining that, it's probably not the best.
So, and of course, that was never going to happen. She's a perfectly lovely person, and it just wouldn't. But every day, and I would wake up just with my stomach in knots, because I knew that hanging out in that middle, wishing that somebody would end it for me, was not a place to be.
No, and it's I have tried to start using that sense of wishing somebody else would fix it for me, like that, because it has a very specific feeling to it for me, where I feel sometimes it also makes me feel like I don't have choices or power. Like, I think that's a story that gets wrapped around it. Like, oh, I don't have a choice, or I can't do this. I wish someone else would do it for me. I'm like, wait a minute. Why did I get in the back seat of the car? Like, I'm sitting in the back seat of the car about something that matters to me. Well, I need to get back into the driver's seat and make a decision.
No, I think you do have a choice. I think it's just that you're not willing to, because if you turn right or you turn left, there's stuff attached. So, geez, it would be so much better if somebody pushed you into that.
Yes. No, but that's the point. I think it can feel like you don't have a choice, but that's sort of the coping mechanism to not acknowledge that you have a choice. You're just not making it. Like, so interesting thing. I think it's like, what do you do with all this? There's a reason that we have real and honest in the tagline of the podcast, because I think it is the salve for so many things, and especially the things where it feels like you're like, oh God, not that. Like, don't. It's like my friend who does nutrition. She's like, people who love cheese are the ones who are actually, dairy intolerant. They're like, don't take cheese. Like, I feel like honesty is that way sometimes. But if you take that like employer situation again, I've seen so many circumstances where when the honest conversation comes out, instead of the just kind of like avoiding the person or pretending to try, like putting them on a performance plan, but not really investing in them, just sort of like going through the motions so you don't look like a bad guy.
Or setting up a performance plan they can't possibly meet. Or
they can, and maybe they do, and then you're still like, damn it. Like,
right. You're disappointed.
Right. So the honesty of going to somebody and saying, you know what, this isn't working. Like, this won't always be the case, but I can't tell you how often I've seen it be the case that the person's like, I know it's not. Like, it's like they aren't feeling like with your fiance, she wasn't necessarily like, oh, I agree. This, she may have had the complete opposite decision. But sometimes you start those conversations and the other person is feeling it too. So bringing that conversation, there's about a 50-50 chance it won't be as yucky as you think it is, because sometimes you're speaking to something that the other person is also sitting in the middle ground on. So that's sort of like the first layer of it. But even when not, the reality of it not being a good fit, or that there being a problem that doesn't work, and being able to address it. So two sort of very quick versions of this, and I'll wrap it back to the other story to kind of wrap this up. Past couple of weeks, I've been involved with a client conversation who was working with someone that was a bad hire on my client's part. And they knew that going in. It was kind of a panic hire, and they kind of knew it wasn't the right thing. We've all done it. And it just, the person's doing all the right things, but it's just not the right fit. And everybody knows it, or, he certainly knew it. Well, and he felt bad about that. So he wanted to keep giving her a chance. Like he's like, well, let's support him. Like, dude, this isn't working. He's like, I know, but it's our fault. We hired the wrong person. I'm like, right, but you hired the wrong person. She's frustrated. You're frustrated. It's never going to get better. And so finally we were able to sit down, and I actually sat in on it to make this conversation go better. Because he was so nervous about it. And we just had that conversation, all of us, with her, and say, hey, this isn't working. And she's like, is this my 2 weeks notice? She kind of panicked. And we said, no. Look, let's all just be really honest about how this isn't working. And let's take the next couple weeks to help you find something else. Like, you keep doing your stuff for us. We're going to restrict it to just these things because that part's working really well. You spend some of your time, and we'll try to connect you with people. And over the course of a couple weeks, they were able to find her something else. And now she's someplace where she can go be exactly what she is, and it's a really good fit.
Right. But I think that I love that solution. I think that in order to hold that conversation, you have to be clear in your mind as to the alternatives you're willing to accept or not. So go back to your initial story. You have a married couple, and if one of them has decided, after whatever angst goes into that she doesn't or he doesn't want to stay married, then going into the conversation, say, this isn't working, let's talk about how we can make it better. If the other spouse is saying, let's go to counseling and let's do this and let's do that, but that the only solution you're willing to accept is an amicable split, then there's a danger, I guess, in pretending that you're willing to collaborate on other solutions.
I think it's more than a danger. I actually think it's cruel.
Yeah.
I think it's cruel to drag somebody through a process where you're pretending like there's an outcome available to them that is not available to them.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. And we're in agreement. You just have to be crystal clear, because you can't go into the conversation hoping, and this is where your strategy
They'll also
ends.
say, yeah,
you just
me too.
hope for that amicable split, and that's it.
No, but what, and this was a different couple because my friend I was talking to this weekend isn't there, but I have other friends who were in this exact same place. And they, you know, it wasn't the most lovely conversation ever. And it wasn't one conversation, but after several conversations, they actually decided that they actually created some very different. So what they did, this story is from 15 or 20 years ago. Family friends of ours, they came up with a solution. They stuck to the conversation of what do we each really care about and what's important to us and what do we not want this to look like. And if, you know, even though this was really a one-sided thing because they didn't both want it, but they were able to stay in the conversation of what do we care about? And they came up with some really off the wall things. Like they actually kept their house and the kids always stayed at the house. And the parents moved in and out because both of them didn't want to have a divorce where the kids were, that was one thing. They didn't want this to impact the kids any more than it had to. So they figured out a solution to that. They are as amicable of a split as I could see there being. And that, you know, again, you get into relationships that leans back on a million variables about, you know, people's personalities and values and whatnot. So I'm not saying that's the way to go, but the point being, the ability to stay in the honest conversation and just talk about the things that is the way through that. What you can't ever do is know where that path leads. But if you keep looking under the rocks of what people care about and what's honest, I think that's how you find your way there and out of that middle ground, because nothing good ever comes in that middle ground.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.